Hi. Well, a professor friend of mine once told me many years ago that context is everything. And it appears to me now, on the back end of 37 years' experience, that he was probably right. Um, and it seems that, I don't know, when it comes to leadership change programs of work that we run in our organisations, that um, we've all got this kind of different contextual background to it all. So I wanted to just kind of offer a few opinions based on what I've discovered along the way, really, and see if it helps set that context a bit differently for everyone. The um, the interesting thing for me is to go back even a bit further in history than this, because this isn't really where things started. This the oil crisis. It's more if we go back and look at the sort of evolution of through the 1700s and 1800s of Japan as a nation through the Tokugawa period. Um, we find that we get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and people are going to America to learn about industrial engineering, and this all was pretty much inspired by the Russians invading Japan to try and get this route through to the Pacific that seems to have been their national objective for centuries. That made Japan question their military strategy. They had a land-based force, and it became very obvious that they needed to move to a sea-based naval strength. So, as part of sending their bright young things off to America to learn IE was all to do with shipbuilding and coming back and trying to be very good and efficient at making boats effectively. And they also engaged the help of an industrial psychologist who was pretty preeminent in her time, which was Lillian Gilbreth. She was a bit of a leading light in many ways for industry. So you've got this situation where in the 1910s, early 1920s, Japan started to listen to the psychologists about how to and the industrial engineers and brought those two things together in a training program that was run by JUICE and MITI, which are two sort of government linked organisations developing managers. And a lot of Japanese management went on that training program from Horigome, who ended up teaching Shingo, and there's all these connections back into Toyota one way or another. So by the time we get to 1946 and the support that the Americans gave Japan, which inadvertently crashed their economy, which was the big trigger for Toyota really having to find ways to get costs down, you have to kind of understand that context, that history behind it as well, to realise how they had started to inherit, I don't know, ways to become a trading nation with the rest of the world, because they realised they couldn't just sit there independently while the rest of the world was developing. So that kind of sets that first bit of historical context. So wind the clock forward. 1958, Yoji Akau introduced Hoshin Kanri as a strategy deployment model that was premised on respect for humanity, and recognised the requirement to drive authority as far down the organisation in terms of its hierarchy as possible, so that people could become autonomous and self-directed, because they recognised the psychology that was kind of inherited from the Shinto belief system, that comprises Buddhism, Confucianism and Taoism, and the human element that is really strong within that system. So we've got already in 1958 this capacity to start to recognise in Toyota that the philosophy in the country culture is leading to different style, different approach towards strategy deployment. By the time we get to 1968, if you read books by Atkinson and some of the guys that went out there very early on, you find that Toyota are already working to parts per billion, 25 years before Six Sigma comes around. So their quality levels are off the chart, and their sales per capita is huge. And then the oil crisis strikes. Okay, so this is when we start to look at the picture in front of us. And what happened on the back of that is that, as the way that I was told the story by the consultants training me in my early days, was that everybody sat up and took notice, because Toyota was still in profit when everybody else had been on 3-day weeks and couldn't even run their factories. And of course that led to this flood of consultants rushing across to Japan to go and see what on earth Toyota had been doing differently. And what came out of that was, a Western interpretation of what was being seen. I mean, we all suffer from our own biases, and as famous philosophers say in various different ways, we don't actually describe the world we see the world we describe, right? Which means our brain has got a wiring, firing pattern function. We've learned how to survive our environment in the that we've been exposed to as we've evolved as an individual, and that's formed our brain. Our brain then interprets the world around us based on the way it's been formed. So we don't necessarily see what's there, we see what we expect, and this whole idea of expectation and prediction is all part of our defense mechanism. So really we're for energy conservation reasons, the way the brain conserves the glucose energy from carbohydrates, it forces us to see what we want to see more than what we actually see. And because of that, we call it bias, and all these different things. But get past that, it's brain function, it's the way we're all built to operate. So we couldn't help but send Western consultants over to Japan and have them come back with their Western interpretation of what they saw. So, to begin with, it started with quality circles, and it challenged the whole idea of batch manufacturing when they started seeing cellularization. So, what that really was presenting, this whole idea of quality circles, was multidisciplined teams working together out of respect to try and make sure that the way each brain has been programmed to function is shared, and this links into this whole theory of bar that sits behind the word Gemba, and going to the place where things happen, but also going to the place where people are in their minds, recognising that that's of incredible value. Because the brain's such a complex, clever thing that, if we don't tap into it and we really share opinions, and without getting defensive and combative with each other, that's what collaboration's all about. And when we collaborate and we work as teams, especially cross-functional teams, we get much, much better results. And what the Western brains brought back from Japan in the early 70s was they all stand around in circles and talk about things, and their quality's fantastic, so we missed the trick there. We missed the philosophy and the deeper beliefs in respect for each other and what we can know and how to bring that together, and we saw this. And actually, people were told in the 70s to build circular tables and stand around them to have their stand-up meetings, and it was very superficial, shallow interpretation of what had been seen. So, a few people got very successful with this, and it turned into TQM from quality circles. It became total quality management, and it started to get more and more codified, but it was also more and more biased towards the Western mindset. So, where we're focused on return on capital employed and EBITDA, and basically financial output and profit, because we're driven to satisfy shareholders, of course. But the best route to that is, obviously what the Japanese had realised. It's making sure we're doing the best thing for the people. And so you've got some terms that started to evolve and start to creep in, but, where it said employee involvement and communication and a strategic and systematic approach to involving employees and communicating clearly between human brains, such that we can continuously improve by practicing Kaizen, which is, this capacity to commit to improving ourselves after we've reflected deeply, which is Hansai, right? So, there's if you look at this through this lens, you can see that the signals were there. But what did we do? We became very process-centered on the right-hand side there at 3 o'clock. We thought about systems and new technology, and it was all driven by satisfying the customer. So we forgot about satisfying the people that are inside the factory, and only focused on satisfying the people that were outside the factory, in terms of shareholders and customers. And really, that's where we kind of became detached from humanity to some extent. And it's ridiculous because we've got other really successful pioneering entrepreneurs out there like Richard Branson, who absolutely get it. Everybody knows he's saying that if you want to take care of your customers, then you take care of your people first. So there's just this disconnect. It just doesn't make any sense that we could think that we can go through life running a business focused on developing process and introducing new technology, and just expect the people to come along, largely ignored and then controlled through HR methods, and policy and procedure where we have to. So that's kind of the way we started to go off on the wrong track, I guess, in the late 70s, early 80s. And it wasn't just Duran, it was Crosby and others that got a big name and a big following in those days. And then total quality management became world-class manufacturing, and then we get into the 90s, and Womack and Jones wrote their fantastic book Lean Thinking, although I always do laugh at the name, because when you read the book, it's not actually about thinking, which is a bit of a shame from my perspective. But we did end up calling everything to do with the Toyota production system lean, and that's what everybody knows. And then the reason that through that 90s period, I think people kept putting Toyota on a pedestal and looking to try and replicate what they had done through the application of the tools and techniques. By this time we'd got total quality, total productive maintenance and 5S and Kanban and cellularization and all these different things that were seen as tools that could be done to companies, ignoring the fact that consultants going in and doing that to people was actually part of the problem and led to the lack of sustainability, because the people were alienated along the way. So but one of the numbers I was given is this sales per capita, profit per person type performance. And in 1994, that was quoted following a big study by one of the large consulting groups as being £140,000 per person. And if you did the maths, which is, revenue divided by quantity of employees, you found that most manufacturing companies back then were at the probably £20,000 to £40,000 mark. So there was £100,000 per person more you could earn in your business if you adopted lean or world-class manufacturing principles and approaches. So that was the big sell. That was the thing that got everybody's attention because of this cultural focus on money. And of course, we still kept blowing past the people piece because it just wasn't there in our culture to put people first, the same way as the Japanese had done. So what we started to see is that, these before and after photos, you've got a messy, untidy workplace, you come and apply 5S, and it improves efficiencies. So this is the message, and it makes sense, it does. And we follow the plan, do, check, act approach, and it's very logical and it's very good and it's right and it's proper. We need that. It's not that I'm not dismissing any of that. It's a requirement. I just feel that it's out of balance with enough knowledge around people. So you've got this issue of lean transformations, and then the big problem started to come out that it's about sustainability. And it had been sustainability on the back of quality circles and world-class manufacturing and TQM, and and sustainability of the changes made and a shift in the actual cultural tone of the workplace was always the problem, whether it was lean, OpEx, Six Sigma, whatever else might have come across. So, let's use 5S as the example. I mean, even that just shouts from the rooftops that we were getting something wrong, because we added the fifth S in the West, right? In Japan, and again, let's look at Toichi Ono and the way he came at things. If you read some of his writings, you find that his biggest focus was on challenging himself, on going into the workplace, going onto the shop floor and thinking about what biases and assumptions he had already made that might filter what he saw so that he didn't see the right thing and didn't do a good enough job on behalf of his people. So it's a very different attitude that Toichi Ono had, which led to the output that we see as tools and techniques, but was really premised on this deep respect for humanity. And so when it comes to things like 5S, what we saw is that it was about sorting the workplace out of respect for the people that had to work in it. There's this whole principle of, if you're going to employ somebody, that means that you're taking the time that they have on this planet away from them with their families. So you have to respect them and make sure that every second that they can't be with their loved ones, that they can contribute the most to themselves, their team, the organisation they work for, and society. It's a much more community-based mindset about how we all pull together and contribute to do the best for one another. And so 5S, which was 4S in Japan originally, was to make sure that people didn't waste time looking for tools. They didn't. Now, because it came with that philosophical context, with that belief system sat behind it, there wasn't any question that people would do it and continue doing it. The sustainability piece wasn't there. So when we came across and tried to introduce that mentality, that mindset as a tool in a Western culture focused on targets and outputs and KPIs and doing as you're told, control mechanisms very much influenced by historic sort of leaders from the army that had come back from the war into business, you ended up with this whole kind of approach that required a sustainability element added on, because you knew it was going to fall over and fail because people didn't believe in it. So it comes down to people's beliefs, not just as leaders like Ono in a respect for humanity, but also a belief in the tools and techniques that you're trying to implement and how they reflect that philosophy. If that bit's missing, it's why it doesn't work. So what we see is, throughout all of Japan, we saw it in the World Cup, didn't we? The guys, the Japanese team supporters in the stands stayed behind to tidy up. How many times have you ever seen that at a football match? So you get this whole impression that it's this underlying philosophy of respect for people and humanity. And now, from my point of view, and having learned what I've learned over 25 years about psychology and neuroscience and how brains function, if we can't have that respect from a philosophical perspective or a cultural perspective, we sure can have that respect from a neuroscience perspective, because when you understand how brains work and how brain function sits behind the lived experience for us all, it demands that we respect each other and our brains. Okay, so the Japanese, like I said, built it into Hoshinkanri, but the overarching element that drives that approach to effective strategy deployment of including people and understanding what that does psychologically for people is this principle called Hitozukuri, which I think we hear in other statements from Ono about we build people before we build cars, right? So that's where we're at, and then that's why in 5S in Japan works, and in the West we see this kind of thing, which is a half-hearted approach. Obviously, a bit of training's been done. Somebody's gone down, got a yellow crayon, made this effort to show where the calipers and micrometers got to go, and then just the idea that we can just have a space for random tools completely misses the point, of course. But it's just typical that when we impose control and we tell people psychologically telling is destructive, we end up triggering resistance. So this whole idea of trying to teach tools is just, and the way we go about putting people on training courses, when we look at it through the neuroscience lens, just alienates people from the beginning, and then we expect them to run with the tools. So this is kind of what I think we're up against, and why I've gone down this light road of investigation to try and understand the psychology and neuroscience, because I recognised very early on, way back in those early 1990s days, that I was seeing people upset and they were disengaging from the whole change program because they were upset by the treatment they received from either leaders or consultants, and it took me off on this tangent to try and find out what is it that makes the people being employed as consultants believe in a change program or a different way of doing something in a manufacturing environment, and the people that live in that manufacturing environment not believing in that and opposing it. And that's where I started off my journey in terms of psychology and neuroscience. So, and now through the neuroscience lens, it all just makes perfect sense, because once you see how brains work, everything else just falls into place. But I mean, just again, the purpose of this little exercise today is just to try and offer those that are interested some context around the evolution over the last 30 or 40 years that I've lived and breathed. And what we also see coming out alongside this lean approach was Six Sigma. Dorian Shainin supported Motorola, and some accounts suggest that Motorola kind of left some of the Shainin method out, called it Six Sigma, and fabricated the numbers to get a 4.5 Sigma to have a nice marketing sounding banner, and won the Baldrige Award as a result of that. I mean, I don't know the validity of those claims; it might not be right, so don't shoot the messenger. But those are kind of some of the articles I've read over the years. So basically, what it meant is that Six Sigma entered the marketplace became very popular because of the results that Motorola had posted, and because people had struggled with some of these iterations of Lean and Toyota copying, it was something else to turn to, and because it was based on logic and statistics, it was embraced by the logical Western mind. So that took off, and then you've got the different timings of different sectors looking at things. Just around the same time, late 90s, that Six Sigma really started to get popular, 10 years after Motorola's posted their success in the late 80s. You got the banking and finance industry and insurance industries looking across to manufacturing to say, what are you doing? To see if they could learn anything from different sectors, which is good. Yokoten share best practice. But what they didn't see is that industrial area had spent 20 or 30 years going through these different iterations of Lean and then adopting Six Sigma as something else to try. And then what happened in the banking and finance industry is that they had a flood of engineers from manufacturing companies move into the banking and finance industry, make the language translation from machinery to transactional issues on computers, and train Lean tools and techniques, quite often linked to Six Sigma type studies, and out of that evolved Lean Six Sigma. After a few years and not getting the results that were required, even though GE and Jack Welch were promoting Six Sigma left, right and centre by this time, you ended up, the banking and finance industry ended up going back towards the Lean side of things. So then a lot more Lean people got employed and the terminology got clarified, and there we sort of evolved, and then recognising that there was more to be done around ERP systems, MRP, and with better processing capabilities and better chipset capabilities. What we saw was some of the early promises from MRP and MRP2 from Oliver White and the ABCD checklist and all that kind of history. That all moved forward to a position where we said, look, if we're going to rapidly launch and concurrently engineer new IT solutions that we're going to call RPA and AI and all these nice new buzzwords to try and get people to put more control systems in place over people, then we can do that now with this new technology and advances. So that kind of led to what Agile, because the whole kind of waterfall cascade Prince 2 project management mentality wasn't working, and so those guys looked outside to see what else could be learnt from other best practice. And it was this kind of merging over years between Lean and what now is called OBEO, originally was called War Rooms, the visual management approach, the cross-functional facilitation of cross-functional teams, all became Scrum and different names, different things that were done all the way for the last 30 years in my experience have just been rebranded basically, and if you're clever enough to change the name of what you do on your CV, you can continue getting paid top dollar. So we're in this situation now where we've got 30 or 40 years of very, very confused market with multiple tools coming from different philosophies all sitting there, and the people piece still being missed. And then of course in the last couple of years post-COVID, we've had Gallup doing their fantastic global studies with massive data sets proving that we've got this huge disengagement issue right across the whole globe, and it all really links back into this raised levels of stress, which is too much cortisol being released on a consistent basis because of the sensory stimulus that's being triggered by the way that we've designed the world with all the technology we've surrounded ourselves by and just the pace of life. So when we look at this disengagement pandemic, we can see actually engagement was slightly, disengagement was falling a little bit, and then we hit the pandemic and it's created this whole new world. And there's that whole list of statistics there. I mean, just to see that the number 6 there, the 630% rise in the number of Google searches for excuses to miss work. If you've got most of your people disengaged, 75% of their employees or 79% of employees just don't want to be there. So you're basically talking about 1 in 5 people wants to be at work and the other 4 don't. How on earth are you supposed to get them to get involved and engaged with a change program? And no matter how you skin that cat, there's all these different statistics that say we're getting the people piece wrong. So, how can we understand this? How can we do more about it? It's biased. It's my worldview. I'm not saying it's right, but it's what I've been able to understand all this through this lens. I've been able to understand this whole situation better is through neuroscience. I mean, what we're seeing now is that we can explain if this chemical is released in this area of the brain because of this sensory stimulus, this is how somebody's going to respond and react. So when it comes to leadership, this is how we've got to conduct ourselves as leaders. But the point is, we've had this knowledge, we've had this advice, we've had checklists, we've had leadership lists, we've had all this. There's enough evidence out there to prove this to people 1,000 times over, and yet we don't change what we do. So what that means is what we've got as evidence of how to conduct ourselves isn't strong enough to overcome the defense mechanisms in the brain, in our human brains, that have evolved to survive our environment. So at the situation, the conditions we find ourselves in, what we're surviving on a day-to-day basis is a stronger stimulus to conduct ourselves on a consistent basis as we have done historically than changing. And unless we make that shift, and you go back to the BTFA model that what we do is centered around, which I come up with about 17 years ago, that BTFA model says believe, think, feel, act. Belief is wiring. So if we don't shift that wiring in people's brains, their actions can't follow because their actions are an output of brain function, right? So the more we know about how the wiring and the firing in the brain affects the emotional state of the people, the more we can inform our approach to leadership. So let's go back to 1958 and Yoji Akau and Hoshin Kanri being introduced. This whole idea of inclusion is so important if we look at it through this brain lens, through the neuroscience lens, because we've got to think about it. I mean, just those guys in that picture touching their hands together there, that's going to trigger the release of oxytocin. Okay, if you've got oxytocin in your system, you have a more warm emotional response towards everything around you at that moment in time than you do if you haven't got that shifting chemical mix in your brain. So what we can do now is we can use the language of neuroscience with absolutely crystal clear facts to cut through all the ambiguous language that surrounds us in industry about things like engagement and inclusion. And we can say, no, this is what you're going to do when you do this to trigger people's brains to respond in the right way. And that leads back into Hoshin Kanri and, the whole idea of catchball. We really then get to start to see how neuroscience unravels the principles that are ingrained behind the Japanese culture. So where we've failed to translate philosophy and culture from east to west, it's a broad statement, you know what I mean. There's lots of ways that people will criticise me for sometimes the way I put things, I'm sure. But, I think we have missed a trick. We've missed the boat when it comes to the people piece. And that was there for Toyota. And that's why they've had the success they've had, because that sits and underpins everything they do from Ono onwards. So once we start to recognise that, and these whole ideas of Kaizen and Hansai and Hitozukuri and Yokoten, we can then start to understand what it is we're not doing when we follow the whole project managed tools and techniques kind of approach to trying to change businesses. And where we failed in that translation, theory of Bar and whatever else it might be that we haven't got that deep meaning for in Western language. And we've got this bias towards the logical, factual. What neuroscience does is it gives us that bridge to close that gap, to build that bridge between those two sides of understanding. So if we use the facts and the logic from brain science, we can make sense of the Japanese culture, and therefore we can make sense of what works and what doesn't work when it comes to leadership and running our businesses. So, what we've found, having sort of evolved the BTFA training and delivered it to many, many people now across the world in many large organisations, is that we can take any management theory. So you can take Hertzberg or Blake and Mouton or Hersey and Blanchard, and you can look at it through the neuroscience lens and make 10 times more sense of it than just understanding it in the words that were used when it was first evolved in the mid-19th century as a leadership or management theory. So it really does give power to knowledge, and it influences the way leaders actually choose to behave themselves, because they come to recognise that it's all about their brain function sitting behind their behaviours and their output being the stimulus for the brain function in other people in their reports. So, I mean, just to keep building on that Hoshin piece, I think, what we miss in the word, when you break it up, Hoshin, Kanri, the 4 kanji characters that represent those words, we find that the philosophy it promotes respect, but also there's these other connotations. It's not just about being the shining light on the needle of the compass that others want to follow because you're setting the standard. It's also about manumission. It's about release from slavery. There's all these deeper meanings to the whole term Hoshin Kanri, and if we don't get that right, then that's why we try and apply these strategic deployment models in logical, project managed, command and control fashion, and they don't work because we miss that deeper meaning. So we've got to really think about Hoshin Kanri being a way to give people direction, to show them the way, but do it in such a way that they can become autonomous, and we respect their opinion, which is why we get the feedback through the catch-ball approach. And if we don't get that human bit right, then we see failed Hoshin Kanri deployment programs. So really, I think that's probably an additional slide there. It says the same thing. We all the way back from the economic crisis following World War II in 1946 to the oil crisis in 1973, there's been a lot of misunderstanding around what it is we're actually trying to copy, and copying the tools, the process and the systems, but not copying the people pieces, where we've really fully gone off down a cul-de-sac, and a lot of people have hit a dead end, and they're sort of now turning around and looking back and saying, well, what did we miss? How did we go in the wrong direction? So I think you look at the Toyota principle, that the 5 blocks as the foundation of the Toyota way, which is first of all challenge, then Kaizen, then Genji Gunbutsu, then respect and teamwork. And my great friend Emil van Est pointed this out to me many years ago in Holland, that they're probably in that order for a reason. The Japanese don't do many things without thinking it through deeply. So the first thing is that if we need to challenge ourselves, just like Taiichi Ohno did, we need to challenge our own brain function, our own assumptions that we make, our own emotional responses to things, and really use this neuroscience to do the Kaizen on ourselves to becoming a better person, a better leader. And when that's where we start, that's when we start to get better results, and then high performance cultures follow. So it really is about leadership. It really is about leaders understanding themselves. And where psychology and philosophy has fallen over the years, I think neuroscience is really going to provide the answers and tick all the boxes. So this is where I think we're at. It really is a great time to celebrate being alive. We've got a fantastic new set of scientific data that's sort of been through all the double-blind experimentation. It's proven from, when Elizabeth Gould did the experiments and moved from using tritiated thymidine as a sort of isotope type tag on cells to bromidioxide uridine cell tagging, and really proved neurogenesis for the first time. This only happened, we only had definitive proof of neurogenesis in the adult human brain, which is neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons. From birth to death, it happens every single minute of every day of our lives. Our brains are constantly in flux and growing new neurons to map our new experiences. Your brains will have new neurons, if you've adopted any of what I've said in this little presentation, representing some of the key points that stood out to you, because those new neurons are starting to integrate and link with your existing neurons, and it could shape the way you see the world, you think, and could even, if it's strong enough, link to the way you change the way you conduct yourself and what decisions you make. So this is exactly the process we're talking about. And the more we understand it, the more empowered we are to choose how we form our own brains and take our own lives in good direction, and do what's best for others. So it's a fascinating time to be alive. We have got, we're just at that point now, sort of, if Elizabeth Gould identified neurogenesis in 2009, it's now 2023, so that's 14 years. A bit like economies, we all normally get some kind of something happen after about 15-year cycles when it comes to humans adapting to stuff on a broad basis. I think we're just at that tipping point now where leaders are starting to recognise why knowing more about neuroscience is profoundly important, and they want that for themselves and for their senior leadership teams. From the board down, investors are looking at this stuff as well, to try and see how they can do a better job of M&A, and get the cultural and integration aspects right. So it's incredibly exciting, it's very powerful, and I hope that helps give everybody out there a little bit of context. So, if it does make sense, if you are interested, do get in touch. We'd love to talk. We're helping a lot of people, but we always want to help more. Obviously, we're a business too, but we do think that it can do a lot of good in the world. So, yeah, good luck with everything that you're up to. Hope that might just give you food for thought. Have a ponder, sleep on it, and if it's of any interest at all, use the link. It's at the top of my profile. Book an appointment. We'll have a chat and see with what we're doing might be able to help you. Thanks.